Well, we finally made it. We finally made it to the finish line, right? We've been celebrating. We've been waiting to pull out all those pastels, right? You've been waiting for those flowers and those eggs and all the candy in the stores. And we made it. We made it to Easter, so congratulations. We're crossing the finish line right now. It's like we've been on a long car ride, right? We've had to stop multiple times along the way for a pit stop to get some snacks and use the restroom. And you're at the point where you're a little bit tired of the journey, but we made it, right? Now we can celebrate, right? You can smell the food that's downstairs, right? Yes, it feels good. And we've come to know along this journey a God that has a love for us that's unending and uncompromising in any way. A God that holds us close and never turns a back on us, no matter how far we stray away, no matter how long it is between visits to church, no matter how much we sin in this life, a God that never, ever turns a back on us. No matter how we're tested or tempted, no matter how thirsty or dehydrated we might become, no matter how reluctant we are to surrender, no matter how condemned that we are, and no matter how we fall. A God that sent his Son to die for us so that we might live with him. A God of light that shines even in the midst of darkness, that promises to stay by our side even in the hardest of times. A God that fills our spirits and reminds us that I will be with you in the darkest of days. You know, time has a way of just moving quickly. You know, the older you get, the more you recognize that it just blows right by you without even recognizing it. And we chase it, but it can't really be caught, can it? And when we're paying attention to it, it seems to tempt us, right? It moves just slow enough that we might dream of stopping it, of slowing it down in some way, but it always proves to be just out of reach. And when we're unaware of it, when we don't pay attention to time at all, when we're distracted by the events in our lives, time moves like a runaway train. It's barreling down the tracks at a speed that can't be contained. And as we traveled through this Lenten season, you might have lost track of time a little bit. The weather started to change. Lives got busier and busier. Spring break came upon us before you even recognized it. And you snapped your fingers, and here we are at Easter. So much in your life has happened to consume you. And for some of you, it might have been the opposite. It might have seemed like this season of Lent has been so incredibly slow that we've just been wading our way through it, and you've been waiting for it to end. But Jesus was no different than us. I'm sure he had moments where his ministry consumed him so incredibly much, where it filled every inch of his focus, where he was so locked into a mission that the clock moved at a breakneck pace. But we also know a different Jesus. We know a Jesus that had intense moments of contemplation, moments of reflection, where he assuredly watched the clock and watched the seconds tick slowly and slowly as he contemplated his fate. These were moments where the clock seemed frozen in place. We spent this series talking all about the ways that Jesus was challenged, about the ways that we are challenged, about the ways that we're called to deal with our trauma, or deal with our past, but also the anxiety of the future. But also, we've talked about the way that God has been there through every struggle, through every adversity, always right by our side. And we know that the hardest cross that Jesus ever had to carry was the one that was unavoidable for him. A cross that we've come to know intimately. A cross that we've kneeled and surrendered to. It's a cross that we've relinquished our brokenness to, and despite this anxiety-ridden journey from that baptism all the way to the cross, despite the dread and anticipation that has loomed over Jesus for this entire 3 years of his ministry, it's clear of the utter significance that it dawned on Jesus at the very last moments that all the way through this journey, he just didn't quite wrap his brain all the way around it until those final moments. And Mark writes, at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lima sabachthani. And it means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we can feel the humanity in that cry. In this moment, Jesus is reciting a verse that comes from Psalm 22. And it's a lament from David. And not only do laments describe an unbearable situation that the author finds themselves in, but it also describes and declares a universal dependence on God. It says, God, I need you. I need all the grace that you have to offer. I cannot, I repeat, I cannot do it on my own. When Jesus cried those verses from the psalm, he was also proclaiming his dependence on God. But I need you to hear this. In that cry for help, he was also crying out in gratitude for the benevolence of God. And Jesus came to this complete recognition that the desperation of humanity suddenly and quite viscerally hung completely on his shoulders. And even in that agonizing moment, his voice called out to show that only God can deliver us. There's a vulnerability here. And Mark, the writer of this gospel, he spent his entire gospel trying to highlight that vulnerability, to demonstrate that Jesus wasn't part human and part God, that Jesus was fully human and fully God, that the human pieces of Jesus were just as important as the God pieces. And we can understand as we read the Old Testament and we struggle to wrestle with these depictions of God, that the God of these days was incredibly unlikable and incredibly temperamental. A God that seemed to sway with the wind. A God that seemed to unleash wrath and frustration and anger and sometimes even pettiness. But Jesus depicts a different, more vulnerable God. A God willing to bear the weight of all of our sin so that we might be free. And this morning, as we celebrate the risen Lord, we are free. We are free indeed. And this is how Mark writes it in his gospel. He said, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they had been saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Look, there's the place they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now after he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. And she went out and told those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they wouldn't believe it. And after this, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. And later he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table. And he upbraided them for their lack of faith and their stubbornness, because they had not believed those who had saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, go into the world and proclaim the good news to all creation. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. By using my name, they will cast out demons, they will speak in new tongues, they will pick up snakes with their hands, and if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover. And so then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and set down at the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that had accompanied it. You've heard this story, right? We've heard it twice. Now it's familiar. But in order to understand any of these stories, you have to unpack it a little bit. We have to understand where it comes from. This writer of the Gospel of Mark is thought to be John Mark. He's the son of a widow in Jerusalem whose home was an early meeting place of early believers. And there's a general understanding that he most likely recorded the events as he heard them firsthand from the disciple Peter. And we get a lot of things wrong when we talk about the Bible. The structure of the Bible is often formed to suggest to us that Matthew was the first gospel, but that's not the case. Mark was the first gospel by a wide margin. It's written in the ballpark of 55 AD, so very, very close to the death of Jesus. And as a result of that, Mark is very different than the other gospels. It's much shorter, and 40% of it focuses on the anguish and sacrifice of Jesus during this final week on earth. And here's the big kicker. Of the original text of the gospel, the one that we can verify, well, it ends with verse 8. This is how that story actually ends. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The end. It's quite the ending. And I've long thought about this ending. It didn't say anything to anyone, and that's the end of the story. They went to the tomb to anoint Jesus, to pour love over this teacher that sacrificed for them, for everyone in this world. Can you imagine the emotions that they must have been feeling, the pain, all the trauma of the death of Jesus in this moment, but also an ending to this story that they had taken a part of. The story that seemed to be building momentum over years and years and years of work. And now all of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, it's over. They must have been feeling relief, but also such anguish that the story ended in a way they couldn't anticipate. But let's be honest. If you got to that tomb, what would you have done? Would you have ran screaming to tell everybody, Jesus is risen? Or would you have tucked it in your pocket and walked away, shaking your head? This can't be real. If we're honest with ourselves, we're probably the same as Mary and Salome. We would have ran away and we wouldn't have told anyone, for fear that our minds and our eyes were deceiving us. That maybe, just maybe, that we were so overtaken with grief that we were mistaken. But they weren't mistaken, my friends. And neither are we. The young man in the tomb says, "Go and tell the disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you." And we tend to breeze right past that part to get to the good stuff, but that is the good stuff. This text is alluding to the disciples returning to Galilee, this city by the sea. We don't recognize that, but here's what that means. The disciples are to abandon their ministry pursuits and return to their lives in Galilee as fishermen by the sea. And that's the end of the story. Change your life. And at the end of it, let's just go back to what we were doing before and pretend none of it happened. But John's gospel tells a different story. It tells a very different story. So what do we do when we're confronted with an empty tomb? What do we do? Do we run away in fear of the power that it holds, of the questions that lay before us? Do we see freedom? Do we see hope? We woke up this morning to a world that feels different for us. Today is this special day, right? It's the day that the Lord has made. It's not just any Sunday, but it's the resurrection day. A day that's all about new life and new birth. But if I'm honest, it could just be another day. You could go through all the same routines, all the same things that you do every single day, and it could just be a normal day. You see, we wake up every morning, every single day, in these tombs of our own creation, surrounded on all sides by walls that we've propped up to keep us from the world, that we think are keeping us safe. These tombs of self-doubt and self-preservation, these tombs of fear and anxiousness, these tombs of hatred and oppression, these tombs of self-pity and of greed. And in these tombs, we get comfortable with our own captivity. It's just the way it is. We find our own rhythms. We get comfortable in our weakness, for we are being held captive by ourselves in our own wants and desires and our own insecurities and fears. And we're shrouded in routine and this selective ignorance of the glory of God that's all around us. And we regularly choose, moment after moment, we choose ourselves over everything else in our lives. We make left turn after left turn after left turn until we end up right back where we started, all alone and exposed. But what do we do when we're confronted with the empty tomb of Jesus? This prison that could not hold him. What do we see? Do we see the world that Mark does? Where a fully human and a fully God, Jesus, defies the grave, setting an example for us that we're called to follow? Or do we just see another opportunity to doubt, another opportunity to project the worst parts of ourselves into the world, so that the world might be as ugly as we feel inside? This is what Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 7. But each of us was given grace according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it is said, when he ascended on high, he made captivity itself a captive. He gave gifts to all his people. And as we sit in this captivity of our own making, captives to sin, prisoners of fear, hostages of our own desire, grace flows bountifully. Love reigns heavenly, and hope stands freely. The stone has been rolled back, my friends, and Christ the Lord is risen. So when we look into that empty grave and we see the gift of new life, may we see hope, may we see freedom, and may we see the love of God calling us, begging us to come out of the grave. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is the hope of God set free. These are your talks with him.